Okay, Ross. Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think in terms of there's quite a lot of experience here, of course, in making applications for EU funding. So I think there will be certainly some benefits in collaboration on that. And in particular, you know, we know very well that the you know, this concept around centres of excellence has been very well accepted within the EU. And so just giving you the references, you know, the cross-references, if you like, in your application could be also quite helpful, where you can talk about building upon the previous activities. So, but anyway, we can talk about that at another time. Okay, so finally, if everybody's still awake, I hope, I wanted to talk about, in a little bit of detail, about the Council of Europe Electronic Evidence Guide. So for those of you that aren't aware, the Council of Europe is the organisation that was primarily responsible with all the partner countries for developing the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which I know has, you know, there are mixed thoughts about the convention, and there have been calls for a UN convention for years, but at the last Congress they didn't get permission to go ahead with considering a new convention, so their focus very much is on capacity building. So I don't really want to go into the discussion about the legislation if I can avoid it, other than to say that the work that the Council of Europe are doing on capacity building and how this document came into existence was that in addition to supporting countries in helping them to develop their legislation for cybercrime, if they wish to ratify the convention, they also look at a number of other aspects that are related. So, for example, they look at the existence of specialised units, not only in law enforcement but also in the prosecution service, and also then look at the mechanisms for international cooperation. Because, of course, there is a requirement within the Convention to create a 24/7 point of contact. They then look at the training for the judiciary and the training for law enforcement, and also looking at issues such as illegal money flow on the internet, relationships between ISPs and law enforcement, and the mechanisms for exchanging information, and also ensuring that the human rights are covered adequately within the legislation and practice of those countries that are ratifying the convention. And then what they do is, primarily what they normally do is for each country conduct a situation report and then look to help to provide sustainable solutions. So that doesn't mean just going in and teaching, or going in and telling them that they haven't got their work right, but helping to create, for example, a memorandum of understanding between law enforcement and ISPs, sustainable training programs for both law enforcement and the judiciary, primarily done by train-the-trainer programs, so that they can then be cascaded within the country themselves. The encouragement is for them to take these materials and incorporate them within their national training programs. So that's just a bit of background about what they do. So, how do we get to an electronic evidence guide out of that? Well, it's quite simple, really. The Council of Europe for a number of years have been receiving requests from countries that are developing their response to cybercrime. And they've basically been saying, well, look, you know, is there anything, have you got something that tells us what we need to do with electronic evidence? Because we've looked at the US DOJ book, we've looked at the FBI book, we've looked at the UK, we've looked at various different countries, but what we really need is something that's developed by an international organisation, so it is an international guide rather than a national guide of one country or the other. And so the Council of Europe decided last year to develop its own electronic evidence guide. Sorry, if I'll take the next slide, please. Okay, sorry, the next one. Don't need that one. That's just a group of people who wrote the guide. So on to the next one. Okay, so This is being developed under a project called the Cybercrime at EPA project, and that's the project that was conducted in the former Yugoslav countries plus Turkey, so the Balkans countries plus Turkey. The Council of Europe have a number of different projects, and they obtain funding from various sources, but primarily for these projects from the European Union. In this particular region, it's because they were either candidate or aspiring countries to join the EU. So this paper was funded out of that program. The important thing to say about this guide is most guides currently are for police officers only, not for other players within the criminal justice system. We felt that it was necessary here not only to incorporate some advice and guidance for judges and prosecutors, but also for private sector organisations, because their procedures for handling electronic evidence and their methods or the legal process for getting them is somewhat different. And for example, in some countries, it's not possible to take the original devices. They must take copies of evidence rather than the device itself. And so we felt it was important, bearing in mind what I said before, that we keep asking people to comply with standards, but we don't tell them how to do it. So we included some of that in this document. So next slide, please. Okay, the important thing to say, or there are a number of important things to say about this, and the first one is that this guide is not for the US, it's not for Germany, it's not for the UK, it's not for those countries that have been dealing with this for some time. This is a guide, as was requested, for countries that are developing their response. So those countries that currently have no guidance themselves. This is not supposed in any way to take the place of any other guide that's out there. It's just providing a template framework, and we recommend to countries that they should take it back and they should then adapt it for their own needs. So we're providing a framework, a template for those countries that don't have it. It's not a manual of instruction, and we've had a lot of debate about whether we should do something like that, and we've decided it really would be impractical because of primarily the legal issues in countries, and so this is a broad approach. It's primarily a basic document, although there is some practical advice in there. So, for example, this guide has a section on live data forensics, which I don't think exists in other guides. It's which primarily deal with pull the plug or dead box forensics and how to do that. That's all in there, but also we've included a section on what to do in terms of live data forensics and also capturing evidence from the internet, which is another area where there's different behaviour that's needed in terms of that as well. Sorry, next slide, please. Okay, well, I've gone over this, so I'm not going to say it again. As I say, most guides are for law enforcement. This is for a wider community. So next slide, please. Okay. The progress of the guide, it really went. It started 2012, so it took about a year really. We did a lot of reviews. It was important to us to make sure that the countries that were the target group were happy with it, because obviously the people who wrote the guide came from countries which already had their own capability, and so we had to make sure that the content was suitable for those new countries. So it went through quite a long review process, a review of the countries, the Balkans countries, and then Council of Europe every year have a conference that's called the Octopus Cybercrime Conference, and so we have workshops at that conference so that people from all over the world go to Octopus. So we wanted a broader review than just those people in the project area, the Balkans countries. And so we again reviewed it, and it was published. It's published on the Council of Europe website now. So the final amendments were done. It was published earlier this year. So next slide, please. So just a little overview of the guide, what's in it, what does it cover, and there's the list there. As I say, obviously we looked at the introduction. We wanted to be very clear about the guide, the purpose, what we were recommending in terms of it. We looked at the evidence sources, and there's imagery as well as a description of the different sources of evidence in there and the type of evidence that you can get from these. We then looked at data held by third parties, so for example internet service providers, or also data that's held in other jurisdictions. So for example, if you're going to do a search on a server somewhere, the data of course may be held elsewhere, and these days of course the cloud is for far more things than just delivering rain in the UK. So, you know, we looked at those issues as well, and I'm fully aware that transborder search is a big issue, and I'm not going to cover that here. That's for another day, I'm absolutely sure. So again, we looked at the search and seizure on site of a suspect, the dead box and the live data forensics. We looked at the capturing evidence from the internet in two capacities: open source online sources, and also we looked at covert activity as well, covert online investigations, where there typically will be interaction between a police officer purporting to be somebody and a suspect. And of course there are big legal issues around that, so depending which country you're from, you either are or are not allowed to do that, and then you've got all the issues around entrapment. So what we tried to look at was ensuring that that countries looked at this, but then developed their own capability. I mean, we've got a very strong regime in the UK, for example, for covering covert online activity. We looked in short at analysing evidence. This isn't a forensics book, so we didn't go into detail, you know, deep detail about forensics. Otherwise, it would have been a door big enough to a book big enough to keep a door open. And so we just discussed some general terms in there. Next slide, please. Again, we've moved on to the preparation and presentation of the evidence as well, so it's not just around the physical activity. We looked at some jurisdiction issues. We provided some specific advice to law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, private sector. For example, one of the things that we're very strong in there is about the selection of expert witnesses, because I think there are lots of mistakes made in that area, and they're not properly and thoroughly vetted. So we've given some fairly strong advice in there as to the selection of expert witnesses. There are a few case studies in there. Importantly, there's a glossary. People said they wanted a glossary. I know glossaries exist in lots of different places. We had a debate about this in ECTEG yesterday, and I think we came up with about 15 different glossaries in publications. But it's important that if you're following a particular guide, that there is a glossary, and that glossary is the one that applies to the work that's conducted there. We've also provided, hopefully, what are useful appendices to this, some in the form of flowcharts, and I think the next slide hopefully should be a flowchart, so perhaps if we can go on to that. Next slide, please. Oh no, sorry, before we get there, we used a number of symbols to demonstrate, because we said that the guide was in some cases very basic, and in other cases was more technical. We wanted to ensure that the reader understood what type of information they were looking at, and so you'll see from there we had a traffic light system to demonstrate which type of information is held in each part of the guide. Sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, so these are the appendices. I mean, these have been about for years. I did the first one for my police force back in the mid-90s, a flowchart, and I still think they're useful. They're useful for people to put in their pocket, and they can go and they can look and see what to do. Or these days, of course, it can be on an iPhone or an iPad or any other device that officers are carrying around now. So we did that. We did the live forensics flowchart. We also did flowcharts for private sector, and we also did one on the acquisition of digital evidence as well, the process to be followed. We also included some documentation because some countries don't have, for example, search records. So we provided a template. Again, this isn't saying they've got to do this in exactly this way, but we provided a chain of custody record, a custodian questionnaire, template exhibit labels, and then an acquisition form as well that covers the processes of acquiring digital evidence from devices. And there are a couple of examples that we'll show now if we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm sorry this is not so visible, but It's the only way to get it on. It's more of a demonstration of the flow than it is actually the text that's in there. So for a first responder who goes to a search scene, there's a clear process for them to follow. And when they get to halfway down, are the systems running? If they are, then the first thing they've got to do is stop, and they've got to then consider the contacting their specialists if the specialists aren't already there. So this flowchart is very much for the first responder, and it would allow them to seize data in a dead box scenario. But you can see from the arrow out to the right, even if you can't read it, that there is a stop part there for them. And if you go on to the next slide, please, that then goes on to the flow for the live data forensics as well. So again, very, very detailed as to what should be done. But having said that, these are templates, these are examples, and if countries decide that they want to do things in a slightly different way and the evidence, the integrity of the evidence can still be retained, then that's perfectly okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, we said before that we were trying to cater as well for private sector, so that if they do seize evidence that's later needed in criminal proceedings, and therefore the criminal standard of evidence will apply rather than the civil standard, we wanted to make sure that they had sufficient advice and guidance to enable them to conduct the examinations or to gather the evidence in such a way in which it would be admissible in a criminal trial, rather than perhaps do civil law seizure and then try and upgrade it to the criminal law process later. So we included that in there as well. Next slide, please. Okay, again, acquisition of digital evidence. Again, I'm not going to go through all these. It's more about demonstrating the methodology that we've done this. We've created a series. We've not just written a book. We've tried to create some useful resources to go with it as well. Things that can be printed off, adapted, and just an idea for countries about how they may wish to do that. Next slide, please. Again, we created a chain of custody record. This is a pretty long document. It goes through all the process from the time that you walk into a search scenario. It gives advice on, what sort of questions to ask to the people on the premises, the drawing of pictures, and we've even done grids so that they can draw pictures. And also we've included in there what in effect is an exhibits register. So sufficient detail for the chain of custody then to be continued. Movement of devices between different locations is all covered in this document. But again, it's not supposed to replace anything that's already in use, but it may provide just some additional information for electronic evidence crime scenes that wouldn't be there for others. So I think we're just about there now. So next slide, please. Yeah, okay, well this is really important. This is we felt that things changed so quickly that what we didn't want for this was for this guide to become out of date too quickly. And so we put a 1-year validity date within the document. You may think that's a short period. Yes, it is. But what it does, it means that the guide has to be reviewed and updated on a 12-month basis. So this is very clear in there that if you're using this guide, it's only valid until the 31st of December. Well, at the Octopus conference this year, which is in the first couple of weeks, or first week in December, there are workshops to again look at the guide to decide whether it needs updating, whether it needs any additional chapters covering other things that aren't already covered. And then that guide will be published, and it's anticipated that each year at the Octopus conference there will be workshops that will update this guide. And in that same context, while I'm on that subject, it's not just about updating guides, it's also about updating training courses that the Council of Europe have developed as well. And I mentioned at this stage there are three training courses. There is a first responder training course that is linked to this guide. And that was developed, and that was run as a pilot course in Oslo earlier on this year. The training pack for that, all of the training materials, all the support materials and everything else is available from the Council of Europe, from the Council of Europe website. So again, that's perhaps some more useful information. The other two courses are specifically for judges and prosecutors, and again, they're templates to be taken away and to be adapted for use. If people want to use them, there's no obligation to, obviously, but we felt as templates they might be useful for people developing their own programs. The first one's very basic. It deals with introduction to technology, introduction to legislation, international cooperation, that type of thing. We did do them as training courses, as I think I mentioned earlier. And the second one is a scenario-based investigation where we put the prosecutors and the judges in the role of the investigator, and what they get is a scenario a paper feed exercise, but also they get presentations about the subject area, you know, how to conduct an investigation, what are the things that you should look for. It's quite common now in many countries for prosecutors to have a far greater influence on the investigation phase of a case than it has been in the past. Certainly in Europe, some legal systems are changing to give more prominence to the prosecutor. So that sort of slipped slightly away, but I didn't want to leave without mentioning that there are many resources actually available on the Council of Europe website. There's also a study on illegal money flows on the internet. And interestingly, I was out in Belarus and Ukraine recently. They've actually shared that document with their financial institutions, and as a result have got a much more efficient mechanism for suspicious transaction reporting, which I know again is moving away from electronic evidence. But I just wanted to give you a flavour of the type of thing that's there. Sorry, next slide please, which hopefully will be the website. Yeah, okay. So yeah, there is a lot of information on there. The Council of Europe are very open about their documents. They publish them on their website. Some of them are obviously legal. Lots of stuff on there, not just about the convention, but there are also and the additional protocols. But there are also guidance notes that are developed. If you're not aware, the Cybercrime Committee, which is made up of all of the parties to the convention, plus other invitees as well, meet twice a year and try and deal with some of the issues that the legislation, you know, some people say perhaps aren't covered in detail in the legislation, so they provide guidance notes. Huge amount of information on there, definitely worth looking at. So that from me is just about it, and I think the question slide is the next one and the last one, and you'll probably be pleased that I'm going to stop talking now. As I often say, I can bore for England on this subject, so I hope it's been of some value to you. Thanks once again for the invite, and at least if it shared some information with you that you weren't aware of, then I hope that's been of value. So thank you very much.